This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
Well, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for coming out and joining us today. So today we have Ute Wartenberg is the Sidney F. Martin Executive Director of the American Numismatic Society. In addition to her amazing work with the ANS, Ute has written and edited over 100 publications related to archaic and classical Greek coinages and has also served on the Citizens Coinage Advisory Committee, the International Numismatic Council, and the International Committee for Money and Banking Museums. Today, she'll be discussing the idea of slow numismatics. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ute.
Thank you. I should say immediately that I've come down with a rather bad cough, so if I suddenly stop and or you can't hear me that clearly, I have to apologize. Slow numismatics, and I'm going to share my screen now. This all really relates to, hang on, let me do this first. Play from start. Okay, continue to share. So slow numismatics, this is of course a sort of joke a little bit on slow food and other slow movements. There's slow art. Slow art, when I was reading about this, means, you know, that on average people, their studies, when they go to the Met, the museum here in New York, they spend 17 seconds in front of each painting. So the idea is take your time and look at it. And I have to say, slow numismatics, this is what, as a joke, a friend of mine said, oh, that's what we do. You know, we never get it published because it takes so long, right? So there are these individual cases, and they all relate to the archaic coinage. And just because I know there's many people maybe on this call that have no idea what even archaic coinage might mean, so I'm giving the briefest of introductions, and for those of you who are specialists, please ignore this. But so archaic really is the very beginning of coinage, electrum coinage. We're looking here at 650 BC, basically, and here we have two famous pieces. One of them, the famous Farnese data from the British Museum, and then a Lydian coin attributed to Valvet, or related to the Lydian kings. And, you know, you probably all know that electrum coinage eventually gets replaced by the gold and silver coinage of Croesus. He's said to be the first to have introduced a gold and silver coinage. And until quite recently, we have thought, in fact, until now, we still think this Croesus, this coinage dates to the middle of the 6th century, and we are eagerly awaiting a publication by Nick Cahill and Jack Kroll that have found some of the coins here on the right in Sardes in a context that might make this a much earlier date. I have listened to a lecture. So the reason I'm mentioning this is that this is a field in which dates, you know, if you're in any other field, you know, most of the time you can date things, but sometimes in archaic coinage, we have situations where we don't know the decade or sometimes even the century of a coin. And after the earliest Croesus coins come in, or maybe at the same time, we have other mints. And here it gives you an idea what these things look like. And the first thing you see is there's just very little writing, if any, on them. We have here only for coins the letter copper, but otherwise it's a question of interpretation. Where do these things actually come from and how are they made? And only in the last century did it become clear, for example, that the coin at the bottom here with the horse is a coin, one of the famous Wappenmünzen of Athens. And this is usually archaeological and numismatic methodology that helps us to determine where things come from. So today, just to set the scene, one of these cases where we have, and here comes these slow numismatics, where basically the opinions we read about archaic coinage are often just repeated. So the handbook that we have of Colin Cray which is, a book from the 1970s, is still more or less that what a lot of people cite, including other much, much earlier publications. And should say one of the great desires that Peter van Alphen and I have, that we discuss a lot and try and think about, is to rewrite a numismatic handbook of archaic numismatics. So we look at all these different mints, and this is more difficult than you would think, because as you perhaps see with this case today, these coins are all interpreted in a certain way. But if you look at them closely and often also over a long time and just try and figure out die studies and so on, you realize that maybe just for a single mint, something is ahead here. So the coinage we're looking at here, we're looking at northern Greece. This is the Chalkidike. And you see here this green underlined is the coinage of Potidaia. This is the one of the coinages that I was sort of casually looking at. Potidaia. Someone wrote to me, and I don't know whether he's on the stalk, had never heard of these mints, but if you maybe lived in the 18th century or early 19th century, Potidaia wasn't so well known because people read their Thucydides, and the siege of 432 is really one of the most famous events. It leads to the Peloponnesian War. Potidaia is a Corinthian colony, but basically an ally of Athens, and revolts from Athens. And this is one of the parts that brings about the Peloponnesian War. And here on the left, this is a Canova, and on the right is a rather wonderful painting by a Russian painter. It's in the Hermitage. And what both of them show, this is what the famous scene is Socrates himself was in this battle together with Alcibiades. And here this is, the young Alcibiades being protected by Socrates. So this was a kind of one of these famous situations. And this battle was, and this whole siege was so famous because it's one of the first recorded cases also in Thucydides of this was so severe, of cannibalism and other things. This battle, the siege, cost the Athenians, who were basically there, 2,000 talents, which is an enormous sum. Every single year, the income that Athens got from allies in the Delian League was 600 talents. So the sum this cost was enormous. This is what we know about this in the later period, but there was a second siege. This is the more famous one, and it was an earlier siege in the Persian War. And here is a rather interesting story about the Persians retreating after Salamis to the north. And here you can read the text, but what this refers to is that the sea retreated, and we probably have here the first case of a recorded tsunami, where the Persian army would go, suddenly the sea retreats, and they're trying to cross towards Potidaia. And the sea then, obviously, as this is the case in tsunamis, returns, and people drown in this, and Potidaia is saved that way. It's a famous story here. Potidaia then becomes a member of what is called the Delian League, and I'm going here a little bit into this sort of history in case you're not so familiar. After the Persians retreat and lose these various famous battles, the Greeks form this Delian League. This is bring all the Greek cities together and say we should not lose again against the Persians, and we all contribute to us. And here the city of Potidaia is one of the very early members of this Delian League. And we know this because the name is inscribed here, and hope you can see this in the middle, this serpent column it's called, which was originally erected in 477 BCE in Delphi, but is today in Istanbul, where you have the name engraved. And we also know from other sources that Potidaia contributed 9 talents and up to the revolt, the one in 432, even up to 15 talents. In short, this is a very wealthy place. The reason Potidaia is connected to Poseidon, in fact, this is the same root, pos is the same thing, is the tsunami that killed all these Persians. Herodotus says, in fact, the reason the Persians got killed was that they did not, the people also who helped the Persians were the people who did not worship the Poseidon, right? So here, and the Poseidon is this Poseidon that you might not recognize. The figure here on the right is what you think of normally more of the god Poseidon, the god of the sea, standing holding a thunderbolt. But there is the Poseidon Hippios, and Poseidon is not just the god of the seas, also the god of earthquakes and such things. So it's a very appropriate symbol for the city of Potidaia. And so this name is being used. And the coins here on the left, you see, this is what all of these coins look at that we're going to look now. This coinage has been, although it's quite numerous, it's not a particularly rare coinage, has barely been studied. The most recent study is in 1953 by Alexander, who wrote a very brief article, and I'm just showing you the plate that illustrates everything there, and it is extremely difficult to make anything out. There is a very, very good catalog with this, but it is always cited, but actually is quite difficult to use, although in its conclusions, remarkably correct, as we will see, to some extent at least. What does this coinage actually look like? It comes on the Euboean standard. This is weighs about 17.4 gram. These are status. There's what we could call drams, and there's different denominations. I just selected a few more, and there are actually quite a few of them. And they always have that same riding Poseidon holding a trident. On the reverse, and we will come on of the smaller pieces, and to which we will come back, is a rather interesting looking hat that is, this head is just interpreted as the head of an Amazon. And we will return to this. And you see that here on all these smaller denominations. So what does this series look like? We have basically three these coins here, and you can see just by looking at them, apart from the one here in the left-hand corner from what is the Taranto hoard, these coins all look remarkably similar and are relatively crude in the way they are executed here. And this is just to look at it. They're generally dated between 510 to 450 BC, and again, this is date-wise is right, and we're just looking at this in some more detail now. So when I had the occasion to catalog some of these coins, just looking at them, this particular coin here, one of the coinages of Potidaia, comes in, and this coin you will find is catalogued as a coin of Potidaia. There are a number of examples on the market. They're also described as Potidaia. And the coin that I was cataloging is in fact the coin below. It's of the same dies. And I was ready to write what I basically took out of this raw catalog to describe this as the inscription pot, when I then looked at these letters a little bit more closely and thought, hang on one second. This does not read what I think it reads. When I looked even a little bit more closely, I suddenly realized that also this particular coinage is die-linked to several other specimens. So die-linked on the reverse. So what I'm saying, in case you don't believe this immediately, this is the same die for several different specimens, and there are some others. And this is something that really takes time. This is where the slow numismatics really comes into it, because it is extremely difficult, because often these coins are photographed a different way, upside down, so you have to turn them and look for things. But the reverse stylings is something, and will end with an example where other people have discovered this, is looking at reverse stylings is one of the ways in archaic numismatics how we can make progress. So Alexander, in his original article, had written here, in the field above, both the left and to the right, there indistinguishable letters, probably pot. Again, with archaic numismatics, there is this tendency, one basically repeats what other people have seen, even when perhaps this isn't the case. Kenneth Jenkins, who was my predecessor in the British Museum too before me, who was really an outstanding numismatist and a wonderful human being, and I have the greatest admiration, in a very small note, publishing this coin, which is from the Lockett collection on Potsy, and is today in the British Museum, recognize that this here is a sigma. I don't know whether you can see here a sigma, and he then read a delta and an alpha. So this was a little bit what he could see on this not very well preserved specimens. And then he said, well, maybe this read pot star. He was clearly not happy with this. But what we see here actually is that this reads SP. This is a pi, alpha, and there is perhaps another letter here at the bottom that unfortunately at this point is not there. It shows how important it is to look at new coin specimens from the market that really help us interpret older ones, and in particular this one. So this in question is, what does SPA mean? How can one identify now these coins? So here is one with SPA, here has no inscription, and here on this coin we have a P, presumably all for Potidaia, and they all link on the reverse. So they're somehow connected both as a region, but also as a chronological feature. And when we look here at the map again, this is always really important for numismatists in the archaic period. When we sort of think something, look at the map. I think maps and numismatics is a really important connection here. We look at what is, and here you see Potidaia being here, Spartolos, an almost direct neighbor, very, very close to Potidaia. So this was a sort of obvious suggestion, and my friend Selene Psoma, who has also worked on Spartolos, also immediately said this has to be Spartolos when we looked at this. Other coins in that region that have a lot of similarities, in particular here is the so-called Olynthos, another immediate neighbor. And you can see, if you look at the reverse of this particular coin, it is extremely different, similar to the coins of Potidaia, which we're going to look at now in a little bit more detail. So this is sort of the context of where this new mint sits. But the way we can really only understand this Potidaia is, and this new coin of Spartolos, is to look at the coinage of Potidaia. We have a die link in this one coin, and therefore we can look at where hoards of these coins are found. And there is luckily quite a lot of them. I'm not going to go through them all, but the most important one here in the area of southern Italy, that's the Taranto hoard. This is our earliest hoards. There's a number of hoards. Not all of them are here. There's one in Scione here in northern Greece. There's the Almale find here, which is also known as second decadrum hoard. And then there's quite a few in Egypt, which you see here with these little red dots. So what do these things look at? The Taranto hoard is probably one of the most famous hoards that, in archaic numismatics is quite early and has extraordinary coins. It was dispersed on the market. They could sometimes come up. Some are in museums. And it also had a lot of hack silver, which is at the ANS, it's in the British Museum, and is published by the ANS. And the mints here are distributed here. These are these little blue dots. This is all from our coin hoards database, which has IGCH 1874 here. What do these coins look like? They're remarkably different from other coins. We have in the first one, which is the number 6, which in my view, is the earlier here of the coin. And we will look at this from a different specimen. It's a kind of dumpy one. And then you have these very, very large flans, really thinly spread. These coins are really curious. And we have a few others I've just given you here too, because they're easy to find. This is this here, this cow. I mean, you would almost not think you're looking at a coin with this above, you know, with this sort of outline, and then this famous coin of Peparethos below. It's a very oddly designed, but they have already, as in the case of Peparethos, a fully designed reverse. And the other thing, returning to the Potidaia, is the Poseidon on the horse, and there is a P. It identifies what mint we're talking about. It says this is a coin of Potidaia. Again, rather interesting. The second anchor hoard is the Asyut hoard, in which luckily, again, there were several specimens, 4 of them. 2 are now at the ANS. These are the pieces here on the left, and then these others are from the book. And here we get a really very, very large group, the Asyut hoard, one that relates in some way to the Persian War and the coinage of the Persian War. And we can already see through the large numbers how many coins of Potidaia, that Potidaia was a major contributor to the war effort. Exactly on what side is a big question to decide. And then luckily for us, the third hoard that had, which is an anchor hoard, is the Elmale hoard from 465 BCE, where we have a single coin of Potidaia, which fortunately for my Spartolos attribution has again the same reverse punch. So that helps to date this Spartolos coin to a very similar date to the coin that we have in the Elmale hoard, and therefore it dates this coin you know, probably to somewhere in the 465 area, actually where Alexander had already more or less put it, just purely dating it on stylistic grounds. And again, important how stylistic dating can be often rather good. So if we now see, these are the 3 periods that we have of the coinage of Potidaia, the early one, which is probably around 510, 500, then a very large burst. Here is only one in the represented in the Asyut hoard and the Elmale hoard. So this is a sort of overview of these. Looking at them in a little more detail, you see how the earliest coins of Potidaia here, how incredibly rough. This is just a very relatively rough incuse. It's very shallow. It's a very dumpy coin. I placed this as the first series of Potidaia, probably to be dated 510. Followed then by this series B, which is probably just a little bit later, but it shows how incredibly different this coin is when you look at it from the earlier one. They're in the same hoard, but you wouldn't even think you're quite in the same period. And related again to this Peparethos, or here I put another one, a coinage I wrote about many, many years ago, columnar, and actually looking at, again, it's not columnar, but it is probably also a mint in the Chalkidike, where this kind of flat flat design exists, and extremely odd, unusual designs in that period of about 500. Then we come to a really massive series. In fact, in this, I call this, what I did there, a fake die study. This is when I'm too lazy to do a real die study. I do fake die study. I collected through auction catalogs and museums and so on 57 specimens of these status, but I did not look at the smaller specimens. But I had a pretty good idea, and I thought initially I could perhaps die link some of this, but these coins are very crudely made. And you can see that here. This is a very, very large group. always that same, if you look here on the right-hand side, how simple this is cut. And is always sitting on the horse, this Poseidon, you cannot barely make out, looks just like a regular rider. You can identify it through the trident that he's holding. And then there is always a star on it. And it's an absolutely infuriating series to try and put into series, because sometimes the star has 5 rays, then come 4 rays. They're recut, and recut. What this suggests, they were made in an incredible rush, and really suggests that at the end of the Persian War, there was a real need, as shown by the siege that we just discussed, the one with the tsunami, that the Persians, were attacking, and money was needed. But it's also possible that before Potidaia was on the Persian side, that it was also made for a different type of the war effort. But there was definitely the activity here is visible in the coinage. And I promised I would talk a little bit about this, this little Amazon, because one of the coins, it just looks like your regular, from the way the Poseidon sits here, but the head it looks like very much like this cap, and the figure itself is really quite mysterious, whether, why it has the head that resembles the Amazon, but really from iconography is, of course, a Poseidon. It's one of these sort of mysteries that we often find when looking at these late archaic coinages. There's just so much variety and infuriating. We have no idea sometimes how to interpret or what it means, so one can just sort of state it and hope someone else discovers it and has a better idea. Then a series E, which is another, for numismatists, really fascinating sort of situation. These were found, these coins you see here where it says 986. Hang on 1 second. The coin here, 986, is a coin in Brussels, but the coin here that you see under the map has puzzled scholars. It was found in the early 20th century, where 3 of these coins were found, or 4, can't exactly remember. And the Berlin, the numismatists immediately condemned them as counterfeit, because they had a look at this strange reverse and said that this thing is a counterfeit, and accused effectively the American excavators of having somehow counterfeit coins. This prompted a real several famous numismatists, including the Aeneas, E.G. Newell, immediately said, no, these coins are real. These Germans don't know what they're talking about. It was quite a situation. And in fact, the coin is definitely real. All these coins are real, because the coin in Brussels shows, this same design. And it's just a very carefully executed reverse, which is so different from what we're seeing on, these other coins here. Here it gets a little bit bigger, but let's say on the earlier coins. So again, one of these sort of one-off, these coins are extremely rare. This series E here, haven't been any on the market in many decades, but that doesn't really mean they're fake and were smuggled into the excavations. Next series here, you can see the muscles. This is now a much more sophisticated looking product. The coin on the right from Berlin is from another famous hoard, the Sargesig hoard. And here, it's sad that it's cut here, because I think this is a really quite beautiful design much later now. And with the next series, we're entering the ones that we're really interested in, the Spartolos whole series here, where we have basically 4 groups. I'm just showing you these coins. And here we get much more variety. We still have the star here on one. We have these odd little pellets that we have on Macedonian coins. On this coin here, which exists in on the right here in the upper row, has a letter pi sort of put onto the horse effectively, and there is like a little bird sitting here. Underneath is another bird flying. And then this is all dialing into that whole Spartolos series. When you look at the sort of dies of these different coins, you can see that they were made in an incredible rush. Again, if the date here, because of this connection with the Alma Lahode of 465, is correct, it is quite possible that these coins had some purpose and were, supporting some kind of war effort or putting into the Delian League. And then here's a coin, this is one of these coins. I put this as the last series K, and this is how the entire Potidaia series of that type at least stops. This is not clear whether this really belongs there. But so there are 9 different series in these 57 specimens. And here's the question now, why would the series of Spartolos be so connected to these Potidaia? This is one of these questions that, that we cannot really completely figure out and cannot, it's quite difficult to see what the connection is. Except these are neighbors and probably are connected relatively closely to each other. And therefore, do they now share a mint, right? This is the big question here. You have the same reverse die. Stylistically, if we look a little bit more closely, and Alexander had already pointed out to the coin on the right how extraordinarily different this coin actually looked in terms of style and how much more sophisticated it was in comparison to the other coins. And here, if you look at the coin on the left, although the state of preservation isn't all that good, and one has to be careful to say too much about this, it is a coin, that seems to be done by a very accomplished die cutter. We have that little dolphin as a symbol. And here, one of the questions that I have not been able to resolve is, what does this star mean that sits under the Poseidon? Does this relate to maybe this tsunami earthquake? In fact, does this entire horse Poseidon figure relate, as some people have argued, to a statue that was in the city? So what we're seeing here on all these coins, and if I just go back a little bit, what is so remarkable when you look at these coins, there's very little variation here. And the idea that this is in fact a statue representation of Poseidon as perhaps in the city, and there was a famous temple related to Potidaia, is quite possible. In fact, when you look at the earliest even representation, you have the line here. It's perhaps a stretch, but the similarity that this Poseidon figure always sits on the horse as it is, and that all this comes the same, sits there, is kind of interesting. And what the star here that is introduced in the period of the Persian War means is one of these mysteries, but it is always with completely different number of patterns. So one of the other parts here is when we return now to Spartolos. What is Spartolos? Spartolos was also one of the cities that was part of the Delian League. It contributed considerably less money. I think it is around two talents that were added to the treasury. Is perhaps a little bit more, but therefore not insignificant, but not as big as Potidaia. So if one now looks at the entire Chalkidike area, let me see here. The question one has, because we get a lot of coins from the Thracian and Macedonian area, which is where this Chalkidike is located. And a number of them are present in the Elmalehort. And here I had already argued a while ago that the coins here on the upper left of the coinage of Ignae were made for contribution to the Delian League. The fact that there are actually found, for example, in the Elmalehort, and the Tutenoi is another one of these totally obscure tribes that also was found in the Elmalehort. Samulia, again, extremely beautiful coins when you look at them, is something that we need to consider, because when you, let's say, if you were to read Cray or some even most auction catalogs look at these coins and saying, oh, they look very archaic, but they're actually all in the early classical period and are extremely rare and were perhaps added as a contribution to the Delian League after the Persians left. And here another interesting, the slow numismatic part that I basically want to point out, and this was discovered by a German collector who published a very good article in the Jahrbuch, is he discovered that this coinage here that is called the Bisalti, which is part of that sort of same period, here it has the inscription on this coins Bisaltikon, and then you have the coins below, which were always dated earlier. And given to this day, you see many people saying this is Alexander I of Macedon, but actually you can perhaps see that this is the same reverse punch. So that means the so-called inscribed Bisalti and what we now call the uninscribed Bisalti are almost the same period when they were minted, right? Because it's quite, otherwise it's hard to imagine how an identical reverse punch can be discovered. And this is another one here, so saying slow numismatic, I have the greatest admiration for that discovery, because there's like enormous numbers of these Bisalti coins, and you have to really turn them in the right position to actually find these dialings. So this is part of this sort of slow numismatic sort of work that one basically has. Excuse me, sorry. So I'm not going to go on for much longer, best because I wanted to open it up for question, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see all these different things and maybe review some of these here. But what the coinage of Spartolos and the connection to Potidaia probably means is that they, in the 460s, during a period when the Athenian General Cimon was involved in Egypt, Cyprus, and other areas, that these coins were minted initially still for the effort, and that the contributions that were made into the Delian League were still made as actually coins, which would explain why people often identify who it is, who that the Bisalti are the Bisalti, because the image itself wouldn't really explain who it is, so that when you hand over your coins, that you could count how much was counted in. After the middle of the 5th century, such coins completely disappear. There's just very few mints in the areas of Thrace, but also Asia Minor left. and the Athenian coinage becomes the dominant coinage. But this interesting fact is really therefore that the archaic, what we call the archaic period, really ends in that period with the 460s, and the coinage of Spartolos presented here as a possibility is one of these relatively unknown and was almost lost that is so rediscovered. And in case you want to read this in even more detail, it came out just now in the Jahrbuch for Numismatic, and it's written in English. And I'll end here and open this up for question, or if people have other comments. Thank you, and I apologize again that I can barely speak. Nobody has a question.
Was there a harp on one of those coins that looked like some kind of a harp?
Yep.
Really?
Yep. This
There.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of the most mysterious coinages. It's a lyre, and in fact, the way something like this is made, you see the little dots. That's
Yeah.
basically a tortoise. So this is a tortoise this is what gives you the body, so it makes a sound. You know how a guitar today is kind of hollow. In antiquity, they used they turned a tortoise, and then they put like strings, on with the sort of wooden contraption. So
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
if I can because I'm sharing, I can't actually see when someone has a question. So please just ask.
Okay, I will jump in if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
This is Ralph Matheson from
Yes.
Illinois. Hello,
Hi.
Ute. It was lovely. I found your talk absolutely delightful for a number of reasons. And I mean, I am going to get to a question eventually, but first of all, looking at the geography and the places, and now I'm going to date myself. It brought back very fond memories of a seminar in early Macedonia. I took at Wisconsin with Charles Edson and Nicholas Hammond. You old timers will recognize some of those names back in the 70s. So it was very like going from the ancient of times to the most recent of times, like the day before yesterday. One of my PhD students was defending a dissertation on the kingdom of the Gepids, and when you're dealing with a people, a topic, there's not a lot of literary evidence. You have to turn to material culture, especially the coins, and she had worked very hard to assemble about 200 Gepid coins, Gepid silver coins, found in the trade since the last publication. Was very pleased with it and had done a nice metrological study. And then one of the classicists on her committee said, "Oh, well, if these are coins coming from the trade, about half of them are going to be fake." And I really had to bite my tongue not to say something. So, but Chuck, they're all die struck, and they're only about $40 each. I mean, but anyway, yes. Question. You mentioned one thing that's very dear to my heart in recent years, and that's hack silver. I mean, even nowadays, if you go to the internet and you put in hack silver, it'll come back Vikings, Vikings, Vikings. But probably in the last 20, not more than 20 years, there's been a realization there's a lot of hack silver in late antiquity, which is what I've been working on. So it made me sit up and take notice when you mentioned hack silver in these hoards. Can you say a little bit more about the use of hack silver at the same time that we have these early archaic coins?
Yes. So, I mean, a lot of these hoards, and I'm very glad that Peter's here, because if there is Mr. Hacksilver, that is, of course, Peter. Luckily, he's coming in, so he's not just disappeared. A lot of these hoards are found in Egypt, right? And these tend to be, there's the Hacksilver hoards that we have. The really fascinating one here is the Taranto hoard that has the Hacksilver associated with this, which is really one of the more special hoards. And the view of what Hacksilver now actually means or how it's used has, of course, changed quite dramatically with this ERC study by Yalongo and I can't remember the other. Peter, do you remember his name? Basically, a study that collected all the Hacksilver material, and what I'm saying here in a very short way would make a really fascinating long table about Hacksilver. They collected all this material and run by weight across all periods, more or less randomly, and discovered that even these individual pieces of Hacksilver are according to a standard. So the sizes were not random. This is a very revolutionary discovery about Hacksilver, which relates to really the invention of coinage and other things. And I have to say, this is a relatively, the study was, these studies are all online. They came out during COVID. We're still trying to sort of fully understand what that means for coinage. And I'm now handing it over to Peter, who has probably much more nuanced views. We discussed that quite a lot, Peter, don't we?
Yeah, no, in fact, I just, in the chat, I put down the reference to the article that you're referring to. This is something by Yalongo, Vaca, and Peronel that was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Archaeological Science, called Breaking Down the Bullion. And so, essentially, again, what they did was look at these bullion weights, or the weights of the individual items in the bullion hoards through statistical analysis. And it really is quite fascinating, because it does show then how a lot of the weights line up, and how weight systems within these bullion hoards, was really quite important, and already sort of indicates that there was monetary function in these early bullion hoards as well. And what's fascinating too about this is that they look at not just silver necessarily, but also bronze and other weight or hoards of bullion as well. But yeah, Hacksilver itself, the silver cut pieces is in some ways a rather complicated subject as well, because there does seem to have been, curiously, for example, in Egypt, in the Archaic and into the early Classical, and actually into the Classical period, a lot of, say, Athenian silver transported to Egypt in the form of owl coinage, which was then melted down, it seems. And in fact, some of the hoards that we have, Hacksilver hoards that we have here at the ANS, do have partially melted Athenian owls, as part of them. But it also seems then that some of this silver, this Attic silver, was then reformed as imitation Athenian coinage within Egypt as well, particularly towards the later 4th century. So how this circle is actually working is at times complicated. And obviously, in an earlier period, in the Archaic period, with some of the other hoards, there also does seem to be some circularity with the way that these hoards are being used both as money, the bullion hoards, but then also being used as a source of silver for the minting of new coins locally as well. So
yeah.
This is actually with the Hacksilver being issued in relatively standard weights. That was also observed by Hunter Fraser in his study of the Trapperian law hoard. And it's also observable in some of the early mid-5th century hoards from Britain. What's really interesting with the Toronto hoard is where coins and hack silver both circulate in the same hoard, indicating that they're all circulating together.
Right.
So really fascinating stuff.
And actually, the interesting thing is, this would be the new thing we used to, that the hack silver, is a kind of, you could call it a coin. This is the only difference that this differentiates now a coin really truly from a piece of hack silver is the design. But that's a really big one, isn't it? So it's really in flux, this whole this whole field there.
Well, the piece that I really love is the bent over piece of hack silver that has a silver silica jammed in the middle.
I'd like to ask a question, and that is, does the archaeological record show scales or balances that could detect what weights these things were?
Yes, I mean, we have a lot of scales actually. In fact, there was a hoard in the trade that I'm publishing just now that had like sort of almost little loops with almost weight-like pieces, and some of them are cut Athenian quarter tetradrachms. Absolutely remarkable. And I think it looks as if these are sort of connected to various weighing things, but there's enough weights and other things, and we know from the concept of weighing things would have been I think that's would have been the normal way how to do that.
And in fact, already in the Bronze Age, we have a lot of archaeological evidence for weights. The Ullebrun shipwreck, for example, which dates to roughly 1200 BC or no, 1300 BC, had a whole series of different weights of different standards, which was the subject of Jamal Pulak's PhD dissertation a number of years ago, and he's published subsequently some aspects of that. And also actually in Linear B, the symbol of a scale or of a balance is the symbol for talent, essentially.
Yeah.
I've been working on Islamic polyhedral weights, which are very common on the market right now. And the articles all say they found tons of weights, but they never found any balances or devices they thought they could use that to balance against something.
I think your point is well taken. This database called Pondera that you undoubtedly where they collect all these endless weights. It's an enormous number of weights of early periods, of old periods, and yeah, maybe they're lost more easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, I just put the link for the Pondera site in the chat.
Thank you
as well.
Yep.
So
yeah, it's a great website. That looks like. Any other comments? Nobody disagrees. No, that's well. Then thank you that you all listened to what is such an obscure topic, and hope that if volunteer, I know we Ryan always says that we're always looking for other things to present. If you have anything, it'd be great. But thank you, and Ryan, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ute. And yeah, if anyone is interested in giving a long table, by all means, please reach out to me and we can get that scheduled.